Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So for today we're doing sort of the part 2 of this full real-time tutorial. So in the last video we did this cherry with our polychromos colored pencils. So if you want to follow along with that video as well, I will put a card up here that will pop up. But today we're going to be working on this cherry, and we're going to be using our Faber Castell Albrecht Durer watercolor pencils. Now, if you don't have these, you can use just watercolors. You can use any other watercolor pencils that you might have. And I've done up some swatches here, and I've put the colors and the color numbers in the description so that you can find these pencils easily. And I've also did little swatches here and added some water already. So if you don't have the exact same ones, you can find a color that's close enough. And if you don't have all these colors, that's fine. Just use what you have. So I'll leave this here so you can see our swatches. So this is the colored pencils, and these are the watercolor pencils. And as I mentioned in the last video, then the really nice thing about these two sets is the colored pencils and the watercolor pencils are pretty much the exact same. So I like to use them together. Today we're doing two separate pieces, but I like to actually use them together. So I'll use the watercolor pencils for the base layer, and then I'll go on top and use the colored pencils for my details. And I'll probably end up doing that in a future tutorial as well. And again, today I'm just trying out this premium sketchbook. It's a mixed media by Stillman Birn. Everything that I'm using will be down in the description, including the reference photo for this. So this little cherry reference photo is from Unsplash. The link for that will be in the description. And before I get into this tutorial, I just want to take a moment to say thank you for everybody that's subscribed to the channel, that is watching my videos, leaving comments, liking the videos. It really shows that there are some of you out here that are enjoying these tutorials and videos. And I just want to say thank you so much because it does really mean a lot. So I'm just going to take my kneaded eraser and I'm just going to lighten this sketch a little bit. Now I've done these two videos, so the pencil one and this one, I'm trying to do them in real time, like full real time, so you can really see exactly, you know, what I'm doing as I'm doing it. So we're going to start with our white pencil. Now, sometimes when I'm doing watercolor pencils like this, and I know I'm going to go on top with colored pencils anyway, I'll take my wax or oil-based pencil, like so my Polychromos, my Prismacolor, Luminance, whatever you have. And where I want those bright highlights, so like we did in here, we put that white down at first, and then it kind of saves the spot. So even when you're blending over other colors, because you've sort of burnished that white in there, other colors aren't going to be able to go on top of it so easily. So when I know I've got a bright little highlight, like right in here, I'll do that with my pencil. But if you don't have that, you can still use your watercolor pencil. You're just going to have to be a little more careful to preserve that spot, because this still will blend out a little bit more, whereas, you know, if you burnish it down, it's not going to blend out as well. But we'll use this white for now. And I'm just going to put it in where that really white highlight is, right in the middle of this. And I am pushing, you know, I'd say medium, maybe a little bit more than a medium pressure for this, just because I'm going to try to get it to do like a sort of burnishing effect. Then we're going to take our beige red, and if you have the older version of the Polychromos, and I believe the watercolor pencils as well, I'm pretty sure it's called Light Flesh. Yeah, so it's Light Flesh. So these are the exact same. The numbers are the same, but the older version is just called something different. So we'll take our beige red or our Light Flesh. In this video, I'm going to call it beige red just because that's what I see here. And we're going to go around this little highlight, or around the white. And I'm just using, you know, a light pressure I always advise it's better to start off lighter with your colors, and then you can always build them up as you need to, but it's sort of hard to take away that dark color once you get it too dark. And I'm going to use this over here for this one too. And I'm just using small circular motions because I want this to lay down pretty evenly. Since it's a watercolor pencil, it's a little more forgiving for blending it out. Whereas the colored pencils, you know, depending what your blending method is, they won't blend out as smoothly. So now I'm going to take the light magenta and I'm just going to add a little bit sort of on the side here and to the bottom half of this highlight, maybe bottom third. Just like that. And then I'm going to go in with Rose Carmine, and I'm going to sort of focus this around the outside of the cherry because there is sort of like a backlit. It's making it sort of like light on the sides, like you can see here where there's a lighter red kind of going around the outside that's a little bit more muted, a little bit washed out, and that's just from the light coming from the side and from the back of the cherry. So we're going to use this in those areas, and just a little bit in front of the stem here. Now, as I would have said in the other video doing the other cherry, you know, your color is not super important. I mean, a warm red is a warm red, a cool red is a cool red, you know. The exact color is not that big of a deal. So if you don't have all the same colors as somebody that you're following along with a tutorial, or like for this one, for example, that's fine. Just use what you have. You may need to layer your colors a little bit more, and depending what your project is. So this cherry's a little more simplified. There's not a whole lot of, you know, layering involved. In fur texture, you would have to layer a lot more colors to build up that depth and color in the fur. But with this cherry, it's pretty much, you know, I'm making this pretty simple. So we're just blocking in colors, but we do want to vary our colors so that there is some variation in there and it looks more like a 3D cherry rather than just coloring it all one flat red color. So it depends. And if that's your style, that's completely fine. You do whatever makes you happy. You know, art is so versatile. There's no one right answer for anything. And that's one of the really nice things about it. And as I'm going along the edges here, I'm just pressing just slightly more. So maybe a medium pressure, just because I want to, you know, really define that edge. And if you've watched the colored pencil version of this, some of the tips that I'm going to give you here might be the same. They might be close. Because really, you know, even though it's different, we're using water instead of, you know, odorless mineral spirits, or instead of burnishing, stuff like that. But the foundations really, like the color layering, certain techniques are really, you know, close to the same. And if I don't mention something that you have a question for, please leave it down in the comments below, and I will try my best to answer that for you. Okay. So now we're going to take our alizarin crimson, and there's a nice bright sort of darker area here. It's much more saturated in that, but I'm going to take the alizarin crimson and do sort of the bottom half of this cherry, you know, just under where that dark patch would be. And I'm going to get it right up to the sides of where we put the rose carmine, and I'm just going to cover the whole thing here. And again, I'm doing those small circular motions because the first layer, I really want the color to get into the paper well. And with watercolor, it's much easier to do that because the water really smushes it down in there into the paper. Colored pencils, you have to be a little more precise. And then in our second layer, you know, you can be a little bit more messy with putting it down. You don't have to be as smooth because that base layer is already there. You're kind of just really deciding what you want to make, you know, pop more, where you want the color to really go. And I'm noticing right off the bat with this paper, just like I did with the other cherry, the color is laying down really well on this paper. Now, this sketchbook says it's a mixed media, but it says it's more of a cold pressed, but I find the tooth of this paper to be quite smooth compared to most other cold press papers, and the colored pencil, as you can see, laid down beautifully on it. I was very happy, very impressed with that. So we'll see how the watercolor pencils do on this. Now I also have the hot pressed version of this sketchbook, so I might end up doing another little illustration, or I might end up doing just the same two cherries on a page, like on my own time, just so I can really compare what it, you know, how both sketchbooks work. Okay, so now I'm just going to go back to that white, and I'm going to go over where we put the rose carmine, because I don't want it to be too bright. As you can see here, it's a little bit more muted, a little more dulled down, and it's a little close to the alizarin crimson. So I'm just going to go over with the white here, just so that when it blends out, it's going to be a little more of a lighter pastel color, hopefully. And if you were going over top of this with colored pencils, let's say, you could use your white wax pencil at that point to kind of, you know, give it more of that like glowing feel instead of using the watercolor pencil. But I'm really going to try to keep this to just the watercolor pencils for this demo. And again, I'm just keeping a light pressure anytime I'm changing from pencil to pencil. All right. So then we're going to go in with our deep scarlet red. And I'm going to pretty much fill in most of this area up here, but I am going to keep just a select few areas here and down here for our deep red color. But I'm going to, you know, focus it mostly in all of this area. I just want those couple of spots where it is really, really dark on the reference photo. I'm going to save those spots just for that color. So right along there. And then sort of along this little bottom edge part. And if your colors overlap a little bit, like I'm sort of overlapping it a little bit towards that alizarin crimson where we put that, that's fine, because in real life, you know, in realistic images, there's not like a stark line where one color starts and one color ends in most cases. Usually in real life, you know, colors sort of merge together. They blend a little bit better. Now here there is a pretty, like, it's almost defined, but not quite in the reference photo. But if your colors overlap a little bit, that's fine. That just makes them blend a little bit easier. And then you can always go back in and really define any edges that you need to. Okay, so we're going to take our dark red now, and I'm going to put it in those spots here where I really want it like to be dark and punchy. And then I'm also going to put it sort of on the bottom half or so. You can see here, sort of on the bottom half of that area. And again, just using a light pressure. So I find the first layer, we're just really blocking in our colors, figuring out where we want, you know, our lights, our darks to go. And then I always like to say a minimum for my artwork is 2 layers, because the first layer I'm just blocking things in. The second layer, you can decide if you want to punch colors up. Do you want things to be more dark, more light? Do you need to blend things a little bit better? But you might decide, you know, after one layer that that's good, that's where you want to leave it, and that's fine. But I always say if you want to level up your art a little bit, start to make it a little more realistic, a little more punchy, then that's where that really, you know, the second layer really comes in handy. And then depending how your second layer goes, you can always go in and just do some final details. And depending what your subject is, you might only need to do 1 or 2 layers. You know, for these little strawberries, this one we only did 2 layers. And it was fine. Now, if you really want to make it even more, you could keep going in, keep layering, keep adding details. Now, on a small scale like this, that's kind of hard because it's such a small area, so it's really hard to get too much detail. But let's say you did your, you know, your cherry in this size instead. You'd be able to get so much more detail in there. And you'd be able to get so much more realism, because if you look at your reference photo from afar, you're just going to see some main blocked in colors, right? But once you start zooming into that reference photo, you're going to see there's little tiny speckles of color within the color, little variations, especially down here and on the stem. But on such a small size like this, it's really hard to get that detail in. So that's why I opt for, I say realism, like I want it to look like a cherry, but I don't need every little tiny detail to be in there. I want you to be able to look at it and say, hey, that's a cherry, you know. Now, depending what your subject is, if you're doing commissions and you're doing, you know, somebody's pet, you need it to look like that person's pet, obviously. All right, so then I'm going to take the, actually, I'm going to keep this dark red for a second, and I'm just going to go down here and start creating that little shadow on the bottom of the cherry. And again, I'm just using that to kind of really define the bottom. Okay. And then now I'm going to take that red violet and just do it underneath the cherry where that sort of cast shadow is on the table of where the cherry would be sitting on. Now I'm choosing to go with a more punchier of a color. You could make your shadow like a gray or a black, you know, do it that way. But really the red of the cherry is reflecting onto the table. So there would be some red in it, and it's a dark color. So I'm just kind of getting like a 2-for-1 in this, really. There. And then I'm just going to go back in with that dark red and just put just a tiny bit of it just towards the top of that shadow right near the cherry, because that's where the most red in the shadow is. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our stem, and I'm going to take this May green, and as I explained in our video for the colored pencil, this isn't quite the perfect color that I would want for this stem, but we're going to use our gray and our green gold to sort of mute this color and add a little bit of variation to it. So sometimes, depending, you know, how many colors you have in your set or your subject, you might not have the perfect color. So you might have to layer a little bit and try to figure out what color you have. And it's nice to do it on a scrap piece of paper because you can try different combinations out before you go to your piece. So I do like that, and I do that a lot. So I'm just going to put a really light layer of this down. And I say light layer because I don't want to risk the tooth getting filled up with pigment, and then we're not able to layer our other colors on top, and then we're just stuck with this one color. So if you go in too heavy-handed, and this is more true with colored pencils than watercolor pencils, but if you tend to go in a little more heavy-handed and start burnishing right away, you do lose, you know, some of that tooth and some of that ability to layer. And I'm just doing this extremely light here because I just want a hint of that green up there. I'm also going to go back in with that alizarin crimson color because I just realized I didn't color the back here. So I'm going to use that same color we used down here and do sort of the back end by the stem here. All right. Now I'm going to go in with our warm gray 2 and go over top of the stem, but I'm not going to go quite up to the left edge of this because I do want to leave that. There is like a green, you know, cast right along the edge, but I'm going to go about 2/3 of the way. And again, just a nice light pressure. And then I'm going to cover all of this top part. And I'm just going to take that May green again and just go in like I've been doing and just really define that edge to about here. There we go. All right, so now we're going to take our green gold, and I'm just going to put this in a few select areas. So sort of down here towards the bottom part of the stem, and up here a little bit, and just along this edge a bit here. So that's where I'm going to focus this color. Okay. Then we're going to take our burnt ochre, and I'm pretty going to much fill in most of this top little part of the stem with this color. Okay. And then I'm going to take the burnt umber and just put this in a few little spots up on this top stem here where there's a little bit more of a shadow and a little bit more of a darker area. So up here at the end, around the green part of the stem, and underneath. And then just a few spots where it's sort of creasing. And then I'm going to take that May green, again, just because there's a little hint of green in here, I'm just going to sort of glaze this just sort of in the middle part of this stem, just to get a hint of green color in there. There. So our first layer of the putting the color down is done. Now I feel like I'm ready to blend this out. And you have a couple options when blending colored pencils, well, watercolor pencils anyway. You can either use some brushes like this, just watercolor brushes, and a jar of water, so you could fill this up with water, or you could have 2 jars depending, you know, if you want one for clean water, one to rinse out your dirty brushes. And when I'm using like traditional watercolors, that's how I do it. But I find for something small like this, I like to use a watercolor brush. You put the water in it, this just unscrews, and you put the water in it, and then you've got different tip sizes that you can use. So just like this, I've got a number 4 and a number 2, so you could use either of those. Now, if you're just starting out or your subject's very small like this, I would suggest it's probably better to go with your brushes, your regular watercolor brushes, because you can control the water a little bit better. With pre-filled pens like this, you're squeezing it to get the water out, and you have a risk to kind of squeeze it while you're blending it out. And if a rush of water comes out onto a small area like this, it's more apt to ruin your picture. So I find these are a little harder to control when you're first starting, so you can really control how much water this is, because you can dip it in your jar, you can tap it off on your paper, do a little bit, decide is that, you know, too much water, tap it off again, not enough, get some more. These are a lot more easy to control, and you have different sizes. So if you're doing a small, you know, part like this, you can really get in there and get into that stem. Whereas these, you know, you still have different sizes as well, but I find these work just as well, and I'll use it, and then you want to wipe off, you know, each color before you go to a different color group, and so that's how I'll use this today. So I just start squeezing it until I see some of the water starting to come out. There we go. So, and see how a big droplet just kind of came out. So it's sort of, you want to, you know, be careful with that. If I'm doing a piece that I'm, you know, giving to someone, or a commission, or if it's a really big piece, because sometimes it's really hard to blend out really big areas with these watercolor brushes, then I will use, you know, my traditional brushes and water. But for something small like this is fine. All right, so I'm going to start at the top part and work my way down into the red, because I don't want to transfer that red into anything. And I always work light to dark. Just because you don't want to risk muddying up your colors or getting those dark areas in places that you don't want them. Another reason I really like these watercolor brushes is because they're easy to travel with. You know, you can just bring a few of these with you rather than having to bring, you know, a jar of water, you know, 2, 3, 4 brushes, depending maybe how small or how big your piece is going to be. These are quite useful. Okay, and I'm going to start with those lighter highlights. And I'm sort of blending in the same way that I laid the color down, small circular motions, just because I want it to blend as smoothly as possible. Okay, and now I'm going to go into that sort of rim lighting color that we had around our cherry. And take your time with this. There's no rush. If you need to pause this video, you know, play it back a few times, or even I would suggest, you know, if you're just really starting out and you really want to focus on what you're doing and to really learn how to use these pencils well, I would suggest, you know, watch the video all the way through one time, and then, you know, have it playing while you're actually doing the project too. So then I'm going to go down into that alizarin crimson color and start blending that. So that's a really good option too, to watch it out fully and then do the project. And that goes for any tutorial, really. And now I'm going to go up here. And if you're finding it really hard to keep your colors in place like this and to really blend everything out in such a small scale, I would suggest try it bigger. So do it in like maybe 3 or 4 times the size of this. It's going to take you a little bit longer, well, quite a bit longer than this project, but you're going to be able to get a better feel for the medium that you're using, and you're going to be able to blend things out better and get better results. So, you know, that might be a good option for you. And now we're getting into where we laid down some of that darker color. And I'm just saving those really dark spots for the very end. Oops. Just sort of lightening this edge back up, or that dark color just got a little too far. Just decided to do its own thing. I'm going to turn this just a little bit, just so it's easier, an easier angle for me. And I'm just taking the edges of this shadow and sort of trying to get most of the color out and just dragging it out so that it gets a little bit lighter as it gets away from the cherry. And then I just will squeeze out a little bit of water there and just make sure that, you know, my brush is clean before I put it away. So that's our first layer for the cherry. Now, since this is watercolor, you're going to have to let this set for a few minutes to dry before you can go on top with your next layer. And as you can see, I don't know if you can see on the camera, but as it dried out, it is a little bit patchy in some areas. So that's why I like to go on with the second layer. Really make things a lot smoother and that. So we're gonna go ahead, let this dry for a few minutes. As you can see, nothing's come through. This sketchbook is actually quite nice. And I like how the first layer came out. So we'll go ahead, let it dry, come back to our second layer, any little final details that we'll need to do, and then this will be done. Okay, so our paper is dry again now. So we're ready to go on top with our next layer. I just want to mention real quickly before we do that, you can use a hairdryer or a heat tool to dry your watercolor pieces. I wouldn't use it on anything you've used solvent on because solvent is flammable. But for just water and watercolor pieces, watercolor pencils, anything that's really water-based, you can use a hairdryer or a heat tool. I would just let you know that sometimes, depending on the weight of your paper, you can get some curling and some buckling. And that, I've most often found it more in sketchbooks rather than true watercolor paper. If you tape it down on all sides, most of the time it will dry out nice and flat. But I will have a video coming out. If it's already out, I will link it right now. If not, it will be coming out soon, how I like to flatten my watercolor. Super easy and very effective. But for most times when I've noticed it in my sketchbooks, once the painting is dry, I just close the sketchbook and then put a few heavy things on top of it to help try to flatten it out. Because the method that I'll show you in the video to flatten out your actual watercolor pieces won't work so well in a sketchbook, especially if you have things on both sides of the paper. But just a little side note there. So we're going to go back in with our white pencil. And again, these are the watercolor pencils, Faber Castell Albrecht Durer. And I'm just getting this little highlight right here because this is the brightest one right in the middle. And then I'm going to go in with that beige red. And in some sets, it's also called light flesh. We're going to go around that white highlight here, just a little bit around it, because I really need to darken up this highlight a little bit. And then just up here towards the top of the highlight as well, because this one needs to be darkened up around the bottom of the highlight. So now I'm going to take this beige red and go around just the edges of this cherry where it's a little bit lighter, where you're getting that sort of like backlit feeling, because I don't want it to be as poppy of a red, because there's a little more contrast going on between here and here, but not so much in this painting. So I'm just going to take this one instead of that carmine rose that we used the first time. And I'm just going to put it in the same places. Now I'm still using about the same pressure. It's about a light to medium pressure. Again, when I go along the edges, I'm doing it just slightly more pressure, like a good medium pressure, because I want that edge to be a little more defined. And because we've already got our base layers down, we have the gist of where our colors are kind of going. You could be a little more heavy-handed now if you really started, you know, wanting to start burnishing your colors in. You could absolutely do that. That's more typical with colored pencils to start burnishing in. But if you're using watercolor pencils, you can also use that technique a little bit to a certain degree, because it is just going to lay down more color for you. But the more layers you lay down with your colored pencils as well as your watercolor pencils, the less water or solvent that you'll need as well to blend them out. So take that into consideration too. Okay, And I'm just going to go on top in a few areas with our white. Now in a piece like this where we do have this, a couple of really lit areas, I would typically use my colored pencil, my white colored pencil, to go on top in these areas. But I'm trying to make this illustration here as true to watercolor pencils as possible. But if this was my typical sort of mixed media piece, we'll call it, I would absolutely use my colored pencil to go in once I've done all my watercolor, because you can't go on top of colored pencil with watercolors because the wax will prevent the watercolor pencils from going on top of it. But once you're done all your watercolor or watercolor pencils or water-based medium, including ink tints, things like that, then you can absolutely go on top and do some detail with your colored pencils. I'm just going to take a little bit of this light magenta and kind of fill in some of these highlights as well. And here. And I'm going to end up bringing up some of this red into the highlight too, because you can see how it's a little more faded here, whereas right now these look like very stark highlights. And in our realistic pieces, we do want our lights to be light and our darks to be dark, because that really punchy contrast is going to lend to the realism of the piece as well. But like I was explaining, you know, in this piece, there's not a whole lot of real straight lines, so things kind of blend a little bit more too. So I'm going to go back in with that alizarin crimson, and again, I'm going to focus it down here in the bottom half of the cherry. I really hope you guys are enjoying these, you know, real-time tutorials. I wanted to just kind of try them out to see how they would go, to see, you know, what kind of feedback I would get. So I'm curious to see how you guys are liking them. If you'd rather just have, you know, the sped up videos and then I can voice over it. Or sometimes what I've been doing too is just, you know, telling you what pencil I'm using, where I'm going to use it, and then I kind of speed that up and then go on to, okay, here's the next pencil, this is where I'm going to use it, and speed it up so you can see it, but it's not real time, it's sped up a little bit. So let me know if you'd rather this, because I know these videos are going to be a little bit longer than my typical, you know, maybe 10 minutes, 12-minute videos. Just depends. So let me know what you prefer, because honestly, I don't mind doing either of them. Okay, then I'm going to take this color back here again. And then we're going to go in with that deep scarlet and sort of focus it on the top half of this shadowed area. And then blend it down into the bottom half as well. And this is a good time in your piece to see, you know, what little adjustments that you need to make. You know, do I need to bring the color out closer to the edge? Is everything in the right place? Does it need to be darkened up, lightened up, you know, to a certain extent? So this is a good sort of time to make those adjustments. And I also find with the watercolor pencils, they don't need to be quite as sharp as what I would have my regular pencils. So I like, you know, a nice sharper tip on my pencils, especially for the first layer, because you really want the color to get right in there. But it's nice with watercolor pencils because the water does the work for us, really. They don't need to be as sharp. All right. So now we're going to take that dark red again and sort of put it in the same places that we did in the first layer, where those nice, really dark shadows are. And I'm just putting a little tiny bit back here, right by the stem where it would be the darkest. And I'm constantly looking at my reference photo just to make sure I've got, you know, things roughly in the right place of where I would want them. Now, I'm also going to take a little bit of this dark red and sort of go down here along the sides, because there is a little bit of darkness just on the two sides here. So kind of the same thing that we did with our colored pencil piece. And the reason I'm waiting for the second layer to do this part is because I didn't want it to get too dark right away, because it's not quite as dark as up here, but it is a little bit noticeable of a difference down here. So just a little bit on either side, because our cherry is a 3D object. So we are going to have some shadowing going around the sides. But we're just simplifying things as much as possible, right? And I'm just going and blending where that line would be, so it's not so harsh of a line. All right, and I'm going to put a little bit of this down here at the bottom too again. Okay, and we'll go back in with that red violet, and again this is going to go towards the bottom of our cherry to create that shadow on the table. And I'm not dragging the color out too far, because we can use our water for that too, to drag it out a little bit. And I'm just going to take a little bit of that dark red and just glaze over top of this. I hope you can't hear that outside. Somebody just started a snowblower up, so I apologize if you can hear that. But I kind of want to get our cherry done. We're making good progress here. So I do apologize for the background noise if you can hear that, but I hope you can bear with me because we're almost done here, our second layer. So I'm going to go back in with that May green, and again I'm going to focus it sort of on the right. Sorry, this is the left, the left-hand side of the cherry stem. And again, just defining that edge right there. And I'm just going to go up to about here on the stem. Okay. And now we'll take our warm gray too. And I'm sort of going to do the same thing, go over the whole part of the stem, except for the very edge here, because I do want to keep that nice and green there, because it is sort of a brighter green just right at the edge. But our gray is just going to help us mute that green down in the other part of the stem. Okay, and then we're going to take that green gold and sort of go just lightly glazing over top of where we kind of put the gray. Just a light glaze. And I'm not going to go quite to the edge of the right. I'm going to keep this sort of in the middle, kind of going up the stem. And then just lightly up here and on the underside where we didn't put that green. All right, and then we're going to take that burnt ochre again and focus it mostly over the whole thing, but if you can still see your little spots where you put your dark umber, if you use that, then you can kind of go around that, because we're just going to put that in the same spot. Okay. And then our burnt umber. Again, I'm just going to put this in a few little select spots where it's sort of the darkest. And around the stem here, where there's a little shadow. And I'm also going to take this burnt umber color and go down here, just around the base of our cherry, right by the stem, on either side, because this is where our darkest shadow is. And that's why I like waiting for our, our dark saturated colors for almost the end, because you don't want to put it in there first layer and then bam, it's too dark for what you want. And I'm also going to bring just a smidgen of it up around that stem. So kind of between where our little highlight line is going to go and the stem, because that's really going to help darken up that area and show some depth so that the stem is going into the cherry. And I'm just going to take a tiny bit onto the side of the stem here where it's a little bit darker, just a smidgen, because that is a art term. So just a tiny bit, and then we could even maybe take just a tiny bit just right under our cherry, just for some different tones. All right, perfect. So now we're ready to blend out. So you'll notice in this cherry we did not use black at all. A lot of people jump to black right away to do their shadows. I find most objects, you want your darks to be dark, but they're not always black or not always pure black. So if you can find your darkest colored dark and try to put that in, so the red over top of, you know, with the burnt umber, that's going to create a really nice dark. So that's what what I'm choosing to use here. If you want to go in and use your black because you can't get it as dark, that's fine. It's whatever your style is or whatever you want. There's lots of pieces that I use, you know, black in my shadows. But just to make this as simple and easy for you guys, then I just decided to reuse some of the colors for certain areas. All right, so again, you can use your brushes, or you can use, you know, a water brush pen like this, just whatever you want to use, and we're gonna blend everything out the same way we did the first time. So I'm gonna start up here, and again, I'm always going light to dark, and if you feel like you get too much water, just wipe it off. Okay, and we're gonna go down into the stem. I really like these water brushes for small pieces like this, because I'm not constantly having to take the extra time to rinse my brush off, dry it off, you know, get some clean water, do that. I can kind of just quickly wipe it off like that and keep going. So I do enjoy these for this. Okay, so I'm going to sort of blend the same. We're going to go into our light highlights. And start blending everything else. And you're going to notice with our second layer, this is where things get a lot smoother, the colors get a lot punchier, your details will pop out more. And then honestly, you know, you can really do as many layers as you want depending how detailed you want your piece to be. To a certain extent, you know, with colored pencils, you're limited to so many layers depending on what your paper is that you're using. But for the most part, you can pretty much layer up and get as much detail as you want. And especially if you're using, you know, the light hand that I've been using with this piece, then it's a lot easier to do more layers. So I'm just trying to soften some of those edges around our highlights too. Because like I said, I don't want such a sharp edge around all of them. Some of them do have like little more sharp edges, but not every highlight will. And I'm just blending down a little bit so we don't have such a harsh line there. And I'm going to blend out this bottom part. And I'm sort of getting the rest of the color off because I want to blend it up into this other part. And then I'm going to blend out this shadow. And then I'm just sort of taking my water brush, making sure I'm getting all the pigment out along the edges, just to kind of drag that color out a little bit, because with watercolor it's much easier than the colored pencils to drag that color out, as you can see. So you can sort of get like a nicer transition. And again, I'm just squeezing, getting the water out, getting all that pigment off my brush, and then there. So I hope you can see the difference between the two cherries. This one's definitely a lot more strategic because you can be very strategic where you're putting the colored pencils down, depending how you're blending them out, really with all methods. Whether you're burnishing using a blender pencil or solvent, you can really focus it because there's nothing that's going to bleed, no water is going to go anywhere. With the watercolor pencils, you still get sort of that painterly look. Not everything is blended out perfectly. You could keep going on top and layering, but I sort of like that with watercolor pencils, sort of any water-based media. It's not, you know, so smooth and perfect. There's little imperfections here and there. Things aren't quite blended out perfectly, but I feel like that lends to the water-based media. I like that in that. If you want this to be completely smooth like this one is, keep going, keep layering, keep doing the same thing on top of it. You can even go on top with your colored pencils too. I would probably do that at this point to really bring out some of those highlights, to bring out this, you know, brightness around there. But for this tutorial, I'm just using the watercolor pencils, and I think that's it. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed doing these 2 tutorials for you in real time. If you guys like this, please let me know. If you've made it this far into the video, let me know down in the comments below if you want to see more tutorials like this, or if you'd rather the more sped up ones. Let me know. And also let me know, because I would like to do some bigger pieces. Well, sort of bigger, like, you know, some more detailed pieces maybe, but it's hard to get that all into one video. And, you know, with my videos coming out on Fridays, I might not get one piece done like completely in 1 week. So let me know if you'd be interested in doing maybe like a part 1, part 2 tutorial, or even I could spend like an hour on it, one part, and part 1 comes out on Tuesday, and then maybe another hour and part 2 comes out on Friday. Kind of let me know what you'd like to see, because I'm sort of mulling around with these ideas. But if people don't want to watch, you know, an hour video, then that's completely fine. I sort of, you know, want to put out what you want, what you're willing to watch. So let me know if you try these cherries out. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, and I will see you in the next one.